In 1950, families stood on a hillside and watched the water rise over their homes. Not because of a war, not because of a disaster, but because the government decided their town should no longer exist. Today, the only thing left is a church tower rising out of a lake, and everything around it is gone. 163 homes disappeared. A school, a cemetery, farmland that families had worked for generations. All of it drowned. The Reschensee Dam provides hydroelectric power to the region. By 1950, Italy was rebuilding after the devastation of the Second World War. The country desperately needed energy. The valley where the villages of Graun and Reschen sat was geographically ideal, a natural basin that could be flooded into a massive reservoir. On paper, the project made perfect sense. More power, more industry, more growth. But on that same piece of paper, the town didn't exist anymore. Some people frame the flooding of Graun as a deliberate act of cultural suppression targeting the German-speaking minority. I looked into that version carefully, and the evidence does not support it as the primary motive. Other Italian-speaking communities in the Alps were also displaced. But to understand what really happened, you have to understand who was standing in the way. In 1919, the people of South Tyrol didn't move. The border did. Overnight, they became foreigners in their own land. And when the project came, they had no power left to resist it. The original proposal from the 1920s called for raising the water level by just 5 meters. That version would have flooded some farmland, but the village would have survived. It was manageable. And then the plan changed. Not slightly, completely. After the war, the project was finalized by the Italian government with a dramatically expanded scope. The new plan called for raising the water level by 22 meters. Not 5, 22. And that single change turned a survivable project into a death sentence for the town. And this is where the story stops making sense. Because the people who were about to lose everything, they didn't get a vote. They got a letter. Let me tell you about what that meant on the ground. In the parish records of Graun, there is the Plangger family. They had farmed the same land for over a century. They had survived Mussolini's decrees. They had survived the war. They had decided to stay. By 1949, heavy machinery had arrived. The Plangger family received a notice from the provincial government. Their property was going to be submerged. The compensation offered was a fraction of what the land and buildings were actually worth. Several families in Curon organized meetings. They protested. They wrote letters to the government in Rome. They begged the regional council to intervene. Alfred Perathoner, the mayor of Curon, traveled to Rome personally in 1949 to plead the case. He argued that the original proposal had promised a 5-meter increase. He argued that the deadly 22-meter plan had never been approved by the residents. Rome did not respond. Because they didn't have to. And this is where the story should have stopped. But the water rose in the summer of 1950. The sluice gates were closed. Families stood on the hillside and watched the water erase their homes, room by room. The bells of the old church had been removed just before the flooding, but the tower itself was a protected historical structure. Under Italian preservation law, it could not be demolished. So they left it standing. The water rose around it. The Plangger family was relocated to a new settlement on a hill above the lake. They were given a smaller plot where the soil was thin and the growing season was shorter. The last compensation case was still open in 1970. The law wasn't against them. It just had nowhere to be. I found this while investigating what happened to Seneca Village. In New York, they buried a neighborhood under a park. In South Tyrol, they buried a town under a lake. Somebody decides your home is worth more as something else, and the law gives them the tools to take it. The Regional Council of Bolzano had actually passed a resolution opposing the 22-meter project. The Italian national government simply overrode it. By the time the water finally rose, this had already been decided for decades. Plans were changed. Objections were ignored. Appeals were unanswered. And when the gates closed, there was nothing left to argue. Building a massive dam that drowned an entire cultural center did not technically violate the law. The silence is the evidence. This was not an Italian anomaly. In 1971, Portugal drowned Vilarinho da Furna for a dam. In 1960, Spain submerged Mancia de la Sierra. Different decades, different flags, the same machinery, and always the same people who couldn't stop it. Too remote, too few, too far from the capital. The bell tower of Graun is now a massive tourist attraction. People take photographs of it. They post it on social media. They call it beautiful, haunting, mysterious. It is not mysterious. It is evidence. Evidence that when the system decides your home matters less than its plans, it doesn't ask. It just waits for the water to rise. The law protected the tower, because protecting stone is easy. Protecting people requires a choice, and no one made it. If your family came from Graun, or from Reschen, or from any of the displaced communities in the Alps, I want to hear your story in the comments. Because the official records only list property values. They do not list what it felt like to watch the water rise over your kitchen door. But at least the people of Graun knew what was happening to them. They watched the machines arrive. They knew the name of the decision. What happens when you don't? When someone in a lab coat hands you a piece of paper, calls it a treatment, and doesn't tell you that the only experiment is you. 400 men in Tuskegee, Alabama, trusted the system with their lives. And this time, it wasn't their homes that were taken. That is next.